Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Welcome to Spaces Virtual Conference, and a few of you, I'm sure, have joined a number of the webinars this week. So, conference on the theme of net zero carbon, climate emergency, 2021. I'm Alan Jarvie. I'm from Atkins, and I'm your chair for this afternoon's webinar. Just before we start and introducing our speaker, I'd like to thank each of our 5 sponsors for these last 2 weeks of webinars: Atkins, Faithful and Gould, IES, NPS Group, and Willmott Dixon for your support. So, as many of you know, all of the webinars over this 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. Delegates and Spaces members will be sent a link at the end of the conference, so look out for that. The recordings will only be available to delegates and Space members. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat box. Hopefully you've worked your way around how the system works. Put them in the chat box, and we will try and answer them towards the end. And I think we'll try and do that today. We'll pick up the questions at the end of the presentation. So this afternoon's webinar is "Do Green Buildings Cost More?" And it's presented by Mike Cross of Willmott Dixon. As I said, I will be the chairperson for the session. I'm a Spaces member and part of the virtual conference sponsor. So Mike will be discussing Opex versus Capex. What is the value changing? How do we value sustainability, and why is it different now? Mike is a Chartered Environmentalist with over 15 years experience supporting organisations and customers to deliver more sustainable outcomes across the built environment. He led the development of Willmott Dixon's trailblazing Now or Never sustainability strategy, committing them to one of the most challenging and ambitious targets in the sector. Mike works across all areas of the Willmott Dixon business to provide leadership and strategic direction, accelerating delivery of Now or Never. Mike, welcome, and thank you for supporting the Spaces 2021 conference. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So you should be able to see the presentation now.
Yes.
Good. So yeah, we've got an hour or so to have a bit of a show and tell and ask some questions around the cost of green buildings. One of the principal reasons that I'm here to share my thoughts with you today is that we had to ask this question in some various guises internally and answer it with our customers when we were developing and launching the Now or Never strategy. So hopefully during the time that it took us quite a long time to get to the point where we felt confident that we had a way of talking to customers about this and be able to launch a strategy about green buildings, which we did last September. You can find lots of information about the strategy. If after today I've sparked your interest, you'll find it on our website. But we'll crack on, and hopefully I'll be able to share something of interest with you. So it's a very simple question, isn't it? 5 words: do green buildings cost more? But actually, the answer isn't quite as simple as the question might make us believe. And actually, when you start to think about the question, it fragments into various different smaller questions, and it's a good topic for a discussion like this because it can be taken in lots of different ways. But it's not a particularly helpful question, I would say, to be asked or ask a customer because it tends to push you in one direction, which is a binary answer of yes or no. And we will get toward something close to a binary answer toward the end of my slides, but we're going to unpack it a bit before we get there. And most of my answers, I'll warn you, do come with a but. So one of the things that I promote in the work that I do at Willmott Dixon and with customers is that we keep our project teams and our customers and our supply chain in the problem before we move to a solution. It's part of the human condition is to answer the question you're asked, crack on and move on to the next thing. But actually staying in the problem, staying in the challenge is the way that we find out new information and we find some insights. And we perhaps challenge some of our assumptions that might have made us jump to a certain conclusion otherwise. And I tend to start things like this with a quote, one of my favourite quotes that I use a lot with people, particularly when we're doing workshops on stuff like this and how we drive change and toward a more sustainable future, which is some sage words from Albert Einstein. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now, that's not a roundabout way of me telling you I'm going to talk for an hour or indeed 55 minutes. I think that I'll be able to share with you what I know in about half an hour and give us lots of time for questions and debate as much as you want, really, for the rest of the hour. But that's the principle that I tend to take a question like this, and we're going to try and do a little bit of that today. So you're probably not going to get the definitive answer till the end of that half an hour. So when I ask myself, do green buildings cost more? These are the thoughts that come to mind. These are the other questions that perhaps will keep us in the challenge, and things that if we can answer these building blocks, we'll put them together and we'll have hopefully an insightful answer to the main question. So we're going to take these one by one and see what we can find out. But just before we do that, a lot of what I'm going to share with you came out of the research and the consultations that we did as part of the development of the Now or Never strategy, which is probably the biggest piece of consultation that Willmott Dixon has ever done before. Took us 2 years of structured engagement and consultations to reach the strategy that we have launched and are now working to implement with customers. And a lot of insights came out of that work that are very helpful in giving us as an organisation and our people confidence in being able to speak to customers about these subjects, because not everyone is immediately comfortable with being asked questions that perhaps they don't know the answers to, but they can work them out together. So really, people's expectations have changed in the industry, and there's a real appetite to change the way we work, change the outcomes that buildings deliver, and for them to be more sustainable. There is definitely a recognition that green building is the future, and we'll come on to what that means. But there is an excitement and also perhaps a driven desire by external forces that we need to transition out of the old way that we perhaps delivered projects into a new, more integrated and outcomes-focused approach, which is a big part of what we're trying to do now on Dixon as part of Now or Never. So if we ask ourselves, well, what is a green building? It's always a good place to start if you're trying to define what something costs. You need to decide what it is you're trying to value. And so for us, I think, or for me at least, there's 3 elements to it. We're going to talk about 2 today. So achieving net zero operational carbon is a must if you're going to say your building is green. And I think that it's what we would term future climate ready, and that optimizes user health and well-being. So that's partly that's about mitigation of climate change in particular, but it's also about adaptation to the stuff that's in the pipeline that we can't do anything about. So our world is going to change. It's going to get hotter. It's going to get wetter. And the buildings that we're building now need to be relevant, valuable in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, maybe longer periods of time. And there's a third one on the end there, which is a dashed line, which is a little bit further off us being able to achieve, but it's important to think about, which is in the not too distant future, we need to be able to deliver buildings with net zero embodied carbon as well if we're really going to tackle the climate crisis. So starting with the outcomes that a green building gives you is a really helpful way to start to kind of flesh out what it is you're trying to value. And those outcomes are generally pretty much agreed upon within the industry, I think. There are lots of organisations, groups that are looking at this stuff. I think probably the ones that certainly that we lean on the most and have the most confidence in, and you may be the same, is the UK GBC and their framework definitions and the work they're doing now to flesh that out a bit and look at things like offsetting gives a really helpful framework. And then you get a bit more meat on the bones if you start to look at the work that Letty have done with their climate crisis design guides and carbon primers and things like that, which are probably available if you haven't seen them. So by coalescing around some outcomes, it allows us to start to, well, that gives us an answer to what is it, and it gives us a way of starting to look at, well, how do we do it, which is what some of the Letty work does. And that starts to, when you need the how to be able to put a value on or a cost on it, because practically it's what are people going to have to do, what are we going to have to pay for to achieve these outcomes. And I'll only touch on this because I think you've probably had previous presentations over the last fortnight that have covered this, but ultimately to deliver those outcomes, we need to work really hard at reducing our energy use. We need to be careful and clever about how we build it and what we build it with to reduce our embodied carbon. And then once we've minimized the energy use, we need to maximize on-site renewable contributions. And then a really important bit is that we need to make sure we kept our promises. So we have to go and measure and verify what we did to really know whether something is green. And so by having these steps, by knowing how to deliver the outcomes we want, that means that experts in our industry, whether they be contractors or consultants, architects, customers, can start to put prices on things. So that answers question one. The next question is, should we, now we know what it is we want, should we be comparing the old world to the new? Is it helpful to do that? It's a natural thing to do. It's our go-to way of trying to determine value for money. Well, I bought one last time, it cost this much, I'm buying another one, it costs X plus 10%. Is that still value for money? But the world we operate in now has changed and is changing. So the solutions that met the needs of yesterday don't meet the needs of today. And a quick example of that would be the car industry. That little car sitting under the bridge, the bronze one, is a Mark I Ford Fiesta. So it's launched in the mid-70s, 1976, and it cost just under £1,900 on the road. And as I was preparing for today, I went and saw if I could. I went and looked to see if I could find a review of that Mark I Fiesta, and I did manage to find one, amazingly. Reading it was absolutely like stepping back in time. The things that were being measured and talked about in the article were things that I certainly now would not look for in a car. I'm not interested really in the torque or how much it weighs or how many revs you get at a certain speed. And miles per gallon were only mentioned in the last small paragraph at the end of this article. Whereas that car on the right is a new Fiesta hybrid version that was launched last year. So that does 58 miles per gallon. As it happens, the little bronze one does just 30 miles per gallon. But so that hybrid costs nearly £23,000. So we wouldn't necessarily compare the value or the cost of the Mark I versus the 2020 Fiesta. And even if you start to adjust that for inflation to understand, well, really, how much different is it? Actually, it's still very different. So that £1,900 back in 1976 is the same as about £12,000 today. So that's still £10,000 different in real terms. But we wouldn't make a decision about buying that car versus buying a previous older version that isn't really designed for the world that we live in now. And in fact, I think if you tried to build that Mark I from fresh and sell it on the open market, you probably wouldn't be able to. It's probably illegal for various safety reasons and environmental reasons. So that's an extreme example, but there is a truth in it, which is we make a decision about whether something is worth comparing based on what we want the thing that we're buying to do. And actually what we want buildings to do now, I think, is a bit different to what we wanted them to do even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 15 years ago. And when we start to look at what's changed, there's a lot changing, and it's changing quite quickly compared to how quickly the construction sector is used to absorbing, assimilating change. things are on the move pretty rapidly, I think. We've got various pieces of emerging legislation in terms of Part L and the plan changes for 2025. We've also got the government's construction sector playbook, which sets out very clear stipulations about whole life value, whole life cost, and carbon reductions if you if you're procuring with public money. We have Boris's 10-point plan, and we have various other commitments that are coming out. So they're all points in a certain direction, and those signals are varying strengths, but it's pretty clear which direction we're moving in. So buying a building which does not factor in these things means you're buying probably an out-of-date solution, if we're honest. So the short answer to should we be comparing this stuff is probably no. Or if we do, you've got to be really careful that you know the implications of or the disparities between the two. So I think that this slide sums up kind of where we are quite well. Questions like do green buildings cost more are perfectly reasonable to ask, but they are sometimes a symptom of the fact that we're still thinking about the old world, if you like, the status quo. And it's a form of backcasting, which sometimes that can be helpful because it can give us reassurance that we're doing the right thing, i.e. what we're doing today is different from what we were doing yesterday. But it doesn't help you understand the future and what the procurement of a building, what problems that might bring you in the future if we don't consider the changing operating environment. And you know, the status quo is a nice place to be. It's what we've grown up in. It's what we understand. It's comfortable. We're experts at it. That's why we're all here. We're interested in it. It's what's led us to have the success in our careers that we've had. And it's comfortable because we know what the challenges are. We've dealt with them before most of the time. They just appear in slightly different forms. But the new world, the emerging world, is here, and it's actually moving towards us quite fast. And that new world brings new needs. It brings unknown challenges or challenges that don't have a technical solution that we all know and are comfortable implementing straight away. And then in the middle, there's a transition, which is where we are now. So we're looking down that gap. That's uncertain, it's challenging, but it's a necessary thing we have to go through. So it's about making that transition as painless and as efficient and effective and as quick as possible so we can get to the other side of that gap. So what we do now is focus on capital cost. And we design things from scratch pretty much every time, even though, you know, there's only certain types of buildings really that 80% of the money that we spend on buildings is in certain categories that we know very well, like schools, hospitals, houses. They all do a similar purpose, but we like to still a level of craft within construction, and that's where a lot of the beauty comes from, the buildings that we build and that we buy. But that tends to perpetuate a focus on on-site trades, which is complicated. It creates problems with quality, and we're still building the same stuff that we were building with 200 years ago, if we're honest. And so this system produces beautiful buildings, but it does create, I think, in a lot of customers' minds, sometimes mistrust with contractors and their design teams, because the price is never quite the price until you've got the keys in your hand. And quality can be variable, even though you've got people that have done these things hundreds of times before. Everything's on site, and so consistency can be a challenge. And so this is what when we say do green buildings cost more, we're kind of comparing, we're taking an old solution which is produced through these four quadrants and trying to force fit it into a new world. And that new world is probably answers or solutions to the problems of the new world are probably better answered by these four quadrants, which is actually we need to be thinking about whole life value. Money's important, but we need to think about the whole life cost and the whole life value of a building, not just its capital cost. we need to be standardizing, and this is going to happen much more, I think, in the future. It's still a bit of a cottage industry. Standardization and prefabrication and modern methods of construction is in its infancy, really, but there's huge potential for us to grow in efficiency, output, and consistency of product. That drives us to far more pre-manufactured value, moving away from just taking people off-site and putting them in sheds to build door sets and staircases, but actually taking a manufacturing approach, which I suspect in the future we'll see a lot more of. And then that moves us, say, a business like Willmott Dixon away from having 150 sites in a year to perhaps having a supply chain which has got 4 or 5 different manufacturing lines within the country. And that gives us a lot more influence over the materials we can use as well. So part of this is about shifting the system toward the ability to produce green buildings with it. Because if you focus on this bit here, this capital cost bit, then the answer, which I'll give you a clearer answer toward the end, is yes, they do cost more. But you're probably not buying something that you are going to want in another 10, 15 years' time. So what sort of costs are we talking about? So we tend to gravitate, as I said, toward capital costs. Capital cost is important. Buildings are expensive things, and money doesn't grow on trees, so we have to be efficient with the way we spend it. But we typically measure capital cost, quality of end product, and time to delivery. Those are the key metrics that a contractor such as Willmott Dixon is generally judged on. But actually, if we want a different outcome, we have to measure different things. And I think construction is exceptionally good at responding to what's measured. We're really good at that. So let's measure some other stuff and bring that into the equation of what this is costing us to enable us to deliver better outcomes. So whole life cost is important. We need to understand what is the trade-off between increasing capital cost and reducing operational costs. Quality of outcome rather than quality of product. Quality of outcome is really important. Product is important, but ultimately people buy buildings because they want what the building does, not that they want the 4 walls and the roof. Schools are about educational outcomes. Houses are about keeping people safe, giving them a place to live and a quality of life. It's not necessarily about owning the structure. So quality of outcome becomes really important when you start to look at green buildings. Time to delivery will always be important because deadlines are deadlines, but probably there'll be less uncertainty about that as we move to a more pre-manufactured world. And the extra bit that we need to be adding on is whole life carbon. So we are not that far away, in my opinion, of having pretty strict regulations around what will and will not be allowed in terms of carbon performance, not just in terms of SAP and SBEM models, but there will be additional mechanisms. Maybe that's more tax on energy, maybe it's carbon markets, but we are going to start to get hit by the level of carbon that we emit during the process of building and operating new buildings. And this focus on whole life cost is really important. So total cost helps us drive value-driven decisions, helps us make value-driven decisions. And this is really where the business case lies. This is where we start to have to demystify the value of building green beyond, tackling climate crises and meeting targets that the customers have set. Life cycle costing is not a new concept, really. It's been around for a very long time, and has, I think, been an underused element of the design process. When we start to factor in the risk of service failure on a building, then things become really quite interesting. It's not just about the replacement and the maintenance of an asset and its components, but actually about, well, can this thing that we're buying function in the world that we believe will exist in 20 or 30 years' time? And if you have a school that consistently overheats, or a care home that consistently overheats, or a hospital that consistently overheats, then actually you can't deliver the outcomes from it that you want. And so there are significant additional costs which should really be factored into whole life costs around significant retrofits, or around loss of revenue by buildings not being operable in certain conditions, that we are only probably just kind of waking up to, really. And those are really important factors when we're trying to work out, does this thing cost me more than it used to? Or if I buy something today which I feel is good value for money, will it still be good value for money in 15 years' time? And another kind of example of this is, I think, that, and a reason why perhaps sometimes customers are a little reticent to trust the words of contractors and people in the construction industry, is that we do have consistently, for a very long time, produced buildings which don't perform as designed, and that gap between energy performance can be up to kind of 200-300%. And so what you think you're buying, what it says on the packet, is not actually what you get. And so green buildings have to wash their face. To be a viable alternative, they need to really make that very clear, that there's a certainty around what you're buying. And we can do that. We've got more data than we've ever had on how buildings perform, on what goes wrong during the operation, the design, the construction of buildings. Contractors have a wealth of that information. It's just about translating it into language that the customer understands, and to give them some certainty. So when we start talking about what kind of costs are we, well, when we start asking the question, what sort of costs are we talking about, then we do have to reframe what we measure and where we perceive it to be a cost. If we focus solely on capital costs, then you're missing a huge portion of the financial costs, but also the potential for savings. So a number of our customers have set, if you like, a different baseline, which is, well, we have put our cards on the table. We have declared a climate emergency. We will be, whatever it is, carbon neutral, net zero by a certain date, and that's our baseline. So anything we buy, anything we procure, must enable us to deliver that. So those metrics are important. And it allows you to shift the question to what are we saving rather than what are we having to spend. But there is also this challenge that keeping a pound in our pocket often feels like the right thing to do. And we do, as part of human nature, is we value a pound today more than we value a pound tomorrow. And that often is the right thing to do. And particularly in uncertain times, coming out of the pandemic, there is a lack of public money. Organisations, and most organisations, have had to redirect their budgets to deal with the pandemic and its implications. And so there's not a lot of cash floating about, and people are concerned about the future. But we need to be really careful that that uncertainty does not drive us to shortchange ourselves today. We'll save a pound today, but then tomorrow we'll have to spend £3 to correct the mistake that we've made today. And so getting our heads around the size of the risks that we face is really important. And so this is probably the bit that you've been wanting me to get onto for the last half an hour. But the key thing is more than what. And then following on from that, well, what are the choices that I'm really faced with? So this is an example of a school in Wales, Somerset School. So we calculated at sort of an early design stage that to deliver the school to building reg compliance is about £5.2 million build cost. If the customer wants to upgrade it to deliver net zero operational carbon, then you're looking at about 12% more. That's a rough figure, and it's probably slightly overestimation. This is only a rule of thumb calculator. But you can see a list of things there. Hopefully you can see them all right. There's a couple in there that actually are not particularly expensive. And you can kind of divide these interventions into two. You can divide them into tech, like air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and other M&E solutions, which are expensive and they drive the cost up, PV, that sort of thing. But there's also a load of stuff in there, which probably is about 3% uplift. If you look at things like installation upgrades, a bit more consultancy fees to make sure that we maximize passive design features, the orientation, the massing, all those sorts of things are really maximized in the base build, if you like, the base structure, and things like air sealing upgrades. So stuff like that is not very expensive actually compared to going whole hog, but makes a big difference to your future ability to retrofit. And so I'll come on to what the options are in a second. Just to push home that 12% a little bit more, what you don't get is much of a saving through energy savings alone. I mean, it varies depending on what type of building you're creating. Lab buildings and hospitals, it's a bit better because they're energy-hungry outfits. But if you're just basing your decision on, well, we'll get, what will the payback period be if we can reduce the energy consumption down to kind of passive house standards, then it's still talking 40 or 50 years, which is not a particularly attractive prospect. So we need to find other things that make a difference. There is a growing body of information out there looking at kind of standard build types and passive house construction approaches, which will help put figures on it. And broadly speaking, it's somewhere, I think, between 6 and 12%. Others might have it a little bit higher. 6 is slightly rose tinted, I think, and 12 is probably worst case in most situations from our experience. But that brings other things with it, right? So depending on what you're building, your outputs from that building, your ability to drive revenue will probably be higher. In the future, your risk of going offline, if you like, because it's not fit for purpose, will be much more reduced as well. And the attractiveness of selling it on is obviously very different in the future. So one of the key messages that we share with customers when we're talking about, well, how much is this really going to cost me when you get down to the brass tacks, is it will cost you more, but there are options to it. And what the last thing you want to do is create yourself a headache for 20 or 30 years' time. Right? We already know that 80% of buildings that already exist, or exist in 2050, I should say, have already been built. And the retrofit challenge is immense. And if you're building things that meet building risk compliance today, you are essentially adding another building to that problem that you or someone else will have to retrofit if you're not keeping hold of it. So that's a really important message, is that you might save £1 today, but in the future you're going to have a problem. So really you're left with 3 options. You can build the current regs. That's perfectly legal. No one's, that's what the regs are there for. And that's your lowest capital expenditure option. But it's the highest life cycle costs generally, it's the highest carbon impact generally, and it's the least resilient solution. There's an interim measure, or a kind of second option, if you like, which is not full green, which is you maximize your passive design. So you do the stuff which is really hard to retrofit. So you do get your massing right, you focus on passive design measures, you get orientation work done to make sure you get that right, do your sun tracking, you get your glazing strategy right, all those things, which means that there's a moderate uplift in capital expenditure there, probably in the region of 3 to 4%. Your whole life cost, your whole life carbon impact is kind of moderate as well. I mean, it's not optimal, but it's definitely better than doing nothing. But it still requires retrofit, and that's what that graph is showing in a very, very basic way, is that, at some point, and we've put it in there for about 2030, but at some point your building will need to be retrofitted if you buy a regs compliant building, or even if you go for this option 2. And that brings significant cost, partly because it's retrospective, which is always more expensive, and it's incredibly disruptive. And that's a serious undertaking, which will cost you more in the long run. And your third option is that you do go sort of full hog, if you like, and you build to net zero, which is your highest capex, but your lowest impact and your lowest lifecycle cost in the building, which is probably going to be most useful in the future. Another way of illustrating that is that you can do it in jumps. Okay, so you can get your fabric right, then you, over the next 10 years, you can start to jump toward achieving net zero if your budgets, financial structures don't allow you to do it all in one go. And those don't have to be equal level jumps, you can do it in increments. So I've spent a little bit longer than I said I would, but I'm going to wrap up now and we'll take some questions. But I think in conclusion, the world is different now. We need to recognise that. And we should not be comparing new buildings that are solving new problems to old ones which actually created some of the problems we're now solving. Metrics are really important. If you care about something and you want to measure it properly, then you need metrics and they need to matter. We've more data than we've ever had before, and we have to use it properly. Construction industry is a slow adopter of tech and big data, but we are getting there slowly, I think. More customers that ask these questions, the more opportunity forward-thinking businesses have to demonstrate what they can do. And the real short answer is yes, it does cost more in capital uplift, probably 6 to 12%. But be really careful. If you choose to do that, be really careful about it. You need to understand the implications of your actions. Don't do it without your eyes being open to what problems you might be creating yourself further down the line. And the last thing I would say is that, unfortunately, there is no one else who's going to solve these problems for us. It is up to us, all of you listening, all of your colleagues, all of our networks. We are the people we've been waiting for. And so we have to kind of embrace these kind of scary challenges, but we're the only ones that are going to solve them. So, you know, we've got to take it in a positive light and look at it in the difference that we can make and how we can sell things in a different way. So I'm going to stop there. I'll stop presenting and I'll hand back to you, Alan. You can tell me if you've got any questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mike. Big subject, so a lot to get into that half an hour. But thank you very much. Not too many questions. So Philip Jordan had one, and I think it was just really at the start of the presentation about, we were talking about the standards, and particularly when you talked about moving from that old world to that future emerging world. Really is actually, as part of your presentation, why haven't you shown the standards that were done away with several years ago? I'm unsure in what context Philip's asked that question, but
well, I don't know. I guess he might be putting words in Philip's mouth here, but some of the work around the old roadmap to zero carbon homes in 2016 and that stuff might be what he's alluding to. I mean, there's a lot of really good stuff that was done there and got kind of abandoned. I think a lot of it we will end up going back to things like allowable solutions and things like that to deal with whatever carbon's left over at the end of a project. The net bit of net zero carbon operation, we will probably end up, you know, re-embracing some of that work. So I don't think it disappeared because the focus was taken away by government agendas moving away from those deadlines. But there is an awful lot of work out there that we can brush off and use. I think the main thing is that we reframe the question when we're talking about it.
Yeah, okay. Hopefully that partly answers your question. Natalie Finnegan's asked a question, and its cost uplift has been identified as between 6 and 12%, as you went through your presentation. Do you know how many projects this percentage range has been taken across? And is there a clear differentiation between the new build, refurb, etc., or is it just too soon to say?
There's two parts there. So the first part, I mean, our work internally, which is, you know, not published data by any means, but we've probably done these assessments on 20 to 30 projects now, and they're fairly coarse assessments. You know, so it's not a forensic analysis, but things tend to be in that range. I think 6 is 6 is kind of optimum. We're not seeing much below 6, and most of our stuff is a bit higher. It's probably 8 to 12. The work by the UK Environmental Council was kind of case study work, so they looked at sort of 3 theoretical projects, I think maybe 4, which you can find in some of their recent publications. And I don't know off the top of my head about the passive house work. It's been a while since I read that, but that's very specifically looking at the cost of passive house, which is different to your communal garden, green buildings, I think, if you would take that with a pinch of salt. But in terms of the retrofit challenge, the problem with retrofit is it is building specific. So it's very difficult to draw broad conclusions to say, well, a new building is going to be easier to retrofit than something built in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s. There will be stuff throughout those decades which there'll be a strong case for knocking it down and doing it again, where there'll be others which, we built stuff, Willmott, Dixon bought stuff way before I was involved with them, back in the 90s at some of the university buildings at UEA, places like that still perform really, really well because the design was really good, the form factors are good, and it's just it's an efficient building, whatever kit you stick on the roof. But unfortunately, I do think that certainly from a housing perspective, in the last 10 years, we've built an awful lot of stuff which is really quite hard to retrofit. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but retrofit is it's unbelievably complicated and challenging. And my one message, if you only take one thing away from this, is do not add to your retrofit woes if you can at all avoid it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nina. Just a question about the copy of the slide pack, and as I say, this will be on there. I'm sure it'll be later on. They'll be shared on the site, and the presentation shared on the site, Nina, after the event, and you'll be shared a link. So, Steve Rufus asked a question, and this is about the standard cost model that you showed. What was the negative 3.88% figure for?
Yeah, so we have Willmott Dixon has developed with a finance partner, a social enterprise, in fact, called Leapfrog. We've developed a PV solution for customers, so that rather than having to buy or put out capital outlay to buy solar PV panels, which is quite expensive, stick on your roof, we have a model where you can essentially get them paid for by this social enterprise, and they will then sell you the energy at a below market rate. So you get the benefit, you get the green energy, you get it at a lower cost, but you don't have to buy it. So it's in there as a deduction because we can remove that cost from customers' budget.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got a question in from Greg Keeling. And it's the conversation about whole life costs and obviously the capital costs. So Greg's asked, do we not just need the government to legislate so we can only build with life cycle costing considerations, low carbon, etc.? Otherwise, accountants will continue to fund Ford Fiesta Mark 1s. I quite like a Mark 1, I must admit, as the lowest capital cost. PSI had one of those orange shirts. Yeah. Greg was in the photo, I think, in 1976.
Yeah, well, legislation would be great, wouldn't it? It would level the playing field a bit. I think maybe that will come. I mean, when you read what's in this construction playbook, it's about as close as you can get without actually making it a law, I think. Challenge will be what government bodies do with that guidance, really. So I think there is an absence of, I think, leadership from government. There's a lot of rhetoric, but we don't see a lot of change. And so unfortunately, as nice as it would be, I don't see it happening very quickly. I think we're at the thin end of the wedge here. So lots of councils, public organisations have declared climate emergency. Something like over 3/4 have now declared one. And there was an 18-month period probably where people were working out what that meant. So we've done it now. What do we actually have to do differently compared to what we were doing before? And then pandemic hit, which has probably slowed some of that thinking down because our focus has been on other elements of society's well-being. So it is slowly creeping through. Some of our more progressive customers are already requiring that we do this, because I think you cannot really deliver low carbon buildings without doing life cycle costing. They kind of have to come together. But the other end of the scale is speculative building developers who will be flipping a finished building very quickly. And there's, particularly in housing, there's huge demand for more housing, and so that demand will drive some of that perhaps low cost procurement. So there isn't a simple answer. I suppose the answer is yes, I agree. It would be great if we had that, but I think as an industry we have to be willing to try and sell this and have these conversations and be experts without waiting for the government, because they're not moving as fast as they need to. Yeah,
no, great. Thank you for that. I've got a couple of more questions, and I think that will see us out then. There's a question from Gregory Ratcliffe, who said, "It is good to see life cycle cost being mentioned in terms of value. Do you think we should start looking at life cycle carbon exercises in the future?" And it goes on to, there is an article on PVs requiring very large amount of carbon emissions to produce and may influence decisions on green measures.
Yeah, I do think we should be looking at life cycle costing a lot more, which is probably the short answer to that. We're doing a bit of work at the moment, actually, with a couple of consultants via Bizria, I think. There's a chap called Alistair Don who gave a presentation last week for Virtual Spaces, who's leading that work for us, to understand the embodied carbon of PV panels and how that varies depending on where they come from, what they're made of. So it is a challenge, and this is the problem with sort of the transition to a greener built environment, is that there's no nice simple answers. Everything's a trade-off, and so we are still, I guess, working out or driving a bit of transparency into these processes to understand the implications and where those trade-offs are. But we need to understand that better. However, I wouldn't let that stop you from investing in PV, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Gregory, for that. And the last question then is from Gisela McIntosh, who said, "On retrofit, how does the cost premium look for retrofit? The fallback position of clients still seems to be like-for-like replacement when elements come to the end of their life, e.g. cheap double glazed windows regardless of performance."
Yeah, and this is true, and a lot of that probably won't change, going back to Greg's point, until we have a bit more legislation or increased tax burdens or something. Maybe it's EPC floors lifting up from F to E to D to whatever, for you to be able to let or sell buildings. I mean, the retrofit premium it's quite hard to quantify with any accuracy. I mean, the simplest way to do it is to take that, say, 12% uplift and then add a bit on, really, which is, I mean, that doesn't sound very scientific, it's not scientific, but that's what most people will be doing. And you can also add in the loss of revenue from being offline. Decanting people out of one building into another, it becomes very expensive, and we forget that we don't have digital twins for the vast majority of buildings that are out there, so we don't really know what they're made out of. Whereas at least now, stuff that we are building, maybe it's inefficient and maybe it's not fit for purpose in 20 years' time. We should know what it's made out of, and we ought to have a BIM model next to it that will speed us up and probably make it a bit more efficient. But the work that we have done in our interiors business looking at a retrofit is that it's almost impossible to give customers a number without making it project specific. It's certainly, for that, let's take that school example that I talked to you about, which is 12% to build it net zero now. I think if you're trying to retrofit that, having not done anything toward net zero, then it's at least 15%, not including your loss of revenues, I think, which could be quite significant, too. So it's definitely the worst option, but putting a number on it is really kind of, you'd have to do it for a project, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I had one question. I think we've probably got a minute just to ask one, really, and it was about there was a figure you stated about increased rental values, so from green buildings, and I'm just wondering if you're starting to see more of that now. Well, that it's almost people power, that corporate and social responsibility value being put on, that people want to choose to go into greener buildings because it's important, and maybe that helping accelerate the journey that we're on.
Yeah, I think that is in there. I don't think it is. It's almost. I think it's below the waterline at the moment. I think we're particularly office space, commercial developments are. We're still coming out of the turbulence of the pandemic. When we were talking before, I imagine most companies are probably shedding real estate rental space rather than taking new stuff on. I suspect, I'm getting my crystal ball out, that within another year, that might well change, and actually the nature of the type of spaces that we want for a business, or any of our businesses to be in, will be different to what it was before the pandemic, and that might well drive a shifting around. It does depend where you are in the country as well. I think there's I used to work as a consultant before I joined Willmott Dixon, and we did quite a lot of office. I did quite a lot of office space work in London, where there is definitely a premium, or sometimes described as a brown discount if you didn't have it. Other places in the country, that's less pronounced. So yes, I think it's there, but I think it might take a little while to come back because the seas are a bit choppy at the moment.
Yeah. Great stuff, and a great way to end. Thank you for that. So it just leaves it to say, I mean, really thank you everyone for attending the webinar. In particular, thanks to Mike. Thank you for the presentation and the webinar you did today. And a thanks to all of our sponsors as for this last couple of weeks in Atkins, Faith and Gould, IES, MPS Group, and Willmott Dixon. Coming up here, there's a poll. So if you can spend a bit of time and actually answer the feedback question on the screen, that would be really, really helpful for us as we gauge the feedback for each of the sessions. And I think as we've gone through here, and has been mentioned in the chat pane, is that all of the webinars over this 2-week period have been recorded. They will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. But reminder, delegates and Spaces members will be sent a link at the end of the conference, and they'll be available to the delegates and Spaces members. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again, Mike. Really interesting. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.